Hey everybody, I'm Dr. Erin, one of the good doctors of Abbey Research. You're very welcome to our YouTube channel. And surprise, it's Dr. Erin here on an Abbey Research Reads book review. Generally, this playlist is dominated by Dr. Kristen because she is a voracious reader and she's much faster at it than I am. So it takes me a little bit longer to get through some of the books that we read for work. But I'm very happy today to be talking to you about David and Jonah Stillman's got to get this out of the ring light. There we go. David and Jonah Stillman's Gen Z at Work, How the Next Generation is Transforming the Workplace. I was originally very excited to learn about this book because most of the Gen Z writing that we've seen so far hasn't dealt with them in terms of the workplace. This is tricky because they're still a very young generation. The oldest members of Gen Z, they were born in 1995. So, you know, just kind of getting to be in the mid-20s at the oldest. Youngest Gen Z, born around 2012, still pretty young, not entering the workforce. So it's tricky to write a definitive book about a generation. We don't really know how they're going to transform the workplace yet because they're not fully in it. And it's also difficult because we can't talk about generations as monoliths either. There's a lot of intergenerational differences within generational cohorts, age cohorts. There's a very big difference, for example, between older millennials who kind of border Gen X, like myself and Dr. Kristen, and younger millennials who are much more closer to Gen Zers than they are to the middle of the millennial cohort. But I have a couple of critiques about this book. It wasn't so great, y'all. And I think it's an important lesson to understand when we're looking at generational research, the questions we need to be asking about the research that's conducted. First of all, it's worth saying this was published in 2017. And so, you know, obviously they couldn't predict the future and they didn't know the COVID-19 global pandemic was going to happen. And so that influences a lot of what we might say definitively about Gen Z, because we don't know how this pandemic will impact any generation, as it will impact all of them, but specifically this generation as they enter the workforce more in the coming years. It doesn't mean that we totally discount what the Stillmans wrote about, but it's worth adding that asterisk to it. Fundamentally, their book is based on a series of surveys that were conducted, quantitative research surveys, asking questions and collating information on a national scale. It sounds like they had a high level of respondents and participants, but that's my first critique of the book, is that they don't provide any information about how the data was collected, what the demographic breakdown was of the respondents, what was the average age, what was the ethnic background or class background or racial background of the participants and the breakdown thereof. It's one of the things that's essential when you're talking about quantitative data. There are human beings behind those numbers. And when you're presenting that data and especially drawing conclusions on it and publishing books based on those conclusions, you have to show some more receipts than these guys produced. And there's a balance between being proprietary about your data collection, 100%, they should have ownership over the work that they did, but you can do a demographic breakdown and let people know that you're drawing conclusions and analysis from a group that looks like this. So that's a big issue, really, that I have with this data, is I don't know how it was collected. I don't know how many questions were on their survey. I don't know who they asked and what the questions read like. That's another huge part of data collection and quantitative data collection, lest this video become a lecture on quantitative data. But words matter and words have a lot of power. And so how you're asking those questions, how you're writing them down, what kind of options you're giving for responses, true, false, A, B, C, D, who is writing the A, B, and C, and D options that a person is going to choose from. Because quantitative can only tell us so much before we have to take the qualitative step and go to these people and say, What did you mean by workplace environment? Why do you want to write your own job descriptions? So they have a lot of data points about Gen Z. It's hard to know who they're talking about specifically or generally. And it left me with a lot of questions. There's a lot of interesting data points in here about who Gen Z is. I think a lot of their cultural analysis is probably spot on in terms of how Gen Z interacts with the world. But another huge problem that I have with this book is its lack of intersectionality. We use this word a lot at Abbey Research. If you don't know what it means, it's basically a recognition that we are all, as humans, comprised of a lot of different identities. I am a woman, I am cisgender, I am heterosexual, I am white, I am middle class. I do not have any physical or mental or psychological disabilities per se. But I do have anxiety that I have treated for and am treating it now currently. So all of those things are a part of what make up who I am and how I interact with the world. And if you don't consider that in your data analysis, it's going to be lacking. And so I don't know the intersectional breakdown of the young Gen Zers that they spoke to. They make a lot of sweeping general statements about Gen Z without recognizing those intersections exist. And so there's a level of privilege that it doesn't appear in the text that specifically Jonah Stillman or his father, David, really engaged with. And privilege, what I mean by that is Jonah Stillman took his experience as a Gen Zer and applied that broad brush to all the Gen Zers. So he talks a lot about Gen Z's reliance on technology and their access to information. And that is true. They are digital natives. They are the most accessible and accessed generation in terms of connectivity, social media platforms, internet. But there's a huge difference between being a middle class to upper class white young man in America and being a low income person of color in an urban area that doesn't have 5G or that doesn't have a mobile phone that is a smartphone and has internet access. And that was lacking from their analysis. And so it took a lot of the weight out of the statistics that they wanted to give me because they didn't show me that they understood a disparity of experiences and that all generations exist on a spectrum. All humans exist on a spectrum. And so you can't definitively say Gen Z does this, millennials do this, boomers feel this way without recognizing those intersections and those disparities. And that comes to my final critique and comment about this book. They make a lot of broad generalizations. Generational generalizations are problematic because you're talking about usually a 15-year age span. And they didn't have, as we say these days, receipts or research or evidence to back up their generalizations. So they would say, boomers feel this way about leadership. One of the ones towards the end that they said towards the end of the book was that millennials will have a hard time engaging with Gen Z in the workplace because Gen Z is more independent and millennials are collaborative and used to working in teams. If that's what you believe to be true, I would need supportive evidence showing you showing me that millennials are going to have that problem. Also, I'm a super introverted millennial and I don't necessarily like working with other people and I like working independently. So again, that broad generalization doesn't apply to everyone in that cohort. So it's really hard when you're talking about age groups and of groups of humans with really high numbers in them. You know, we're talking, I believe there's upwards of close to 70 million Gen Zers in this country. There's over almost 80 million millennials. So it's hard to make distinct analyses about groups that are so large, but it's possible to do a bit of a better job than the Stillmans did in this book. And it comes from knowing how to do research and analysis. And I think fundamentally what's lacking in this book is a lack of understanding about how quantitative research is conducted and the responsibility of the researchers to show their work. You know, this is all stuff that we learned in algebra class in middle school, that you can't just write down the answer and say, this is the answer. You have to be able to show how you got to that answer to prove that you know what you're doing and you did the work to get there. So it's a jumping off point. There's a lot of interesting data points and survey results. I would love to see more about how they got those survey results and how they conducted and ran the survey and who they spoke to. We'll be continuing to talk about generations throughout this year and Gen Z in particular, but pick up this book if you would like to start a conversation about Gen Z, but bear in mind those critiques, especially the fact that it was published well before COVID. They did a lot of work to produce this book, but without considering the impact of the pandemic, it's really, really challenging to say how Gen Z is going to react in the workplace. So we will continue to have these conversations on our channel. I hope you enjoyed this conversation today. Make sure to like the videos, subscribe to the channel, and comment below to engage in more conversations with myself and Dr. Kristen, who is on this particular playlist a lot more regularly. I will endeavor to get a book finished soon so I can talk to you folks about it. Until then, take care, everybody.